welcome back to the podcast with me, Andy Duncan. That's Andy009 Duncan at Twitter. And my guest, as from last week in part 1, this is part 2. And we're talking about the Great Reset and the War on Liberty. And my guest is Greg Moffitt, the fantastic, the amazing Greg Moffitt. And he is at Legalise Freedom, which I will link to in the show notes. Now, in our first part last week, we talked about 4 things which could be coming up very soon, as pushed by the WEF and people like Klaus Schwab. And we also talked about his book, The Great Reset, from Davos. And we also talked about the first plank of that, which is the control of the economy. We've got 2 more planks to go, which is going to be energy and the environment. And then we'll talk about how we can fight back and push back against these people and squash them back into a very small box. Anyhow, welcome back, Greg.
Thanks, Andy. Great to be with you again.
Let me just get my headphones so I can hear you actually talking, which is good. So let us get on then. So we finished with talking a little, we were straying into energy there. So let's get into a little bit more into the kind of energy thing. Now, one of the things they're trying to push at Davos and the WEF and the Great Reset is smart everything. So we've got smart energy, smart meters, and this is the Panopticon state again. Do you want to tell us even about smart toilets? What's going on with smart toilets?
Smart toilets. I mean, it's smart everything, as you say. Smart toilets is actually, I think whoever tried to seriously talk about that probably regrets it, because it became something that critics of these schemes and agendas just used to illustrate how ludicrous it could become. I don't know whether the idea was to sample and monitor the contents of your stool, with a view to suggesting dietary changes or whatever. But yeah, all of this is linked to because in this context, energy and environment are completely intertwined. So all of these smart devices, most of which are not smart at all, but it sounds good, doesn't it? Who wouldn't want a smart device? And it's interesting that those people, for example, who have been marketing new dumb phones, because if you want a dumb phone, you don't just have to buy an old Nokia from the 2000s. There's I can't remember the name of the company, unfortunately, but there's a company now manufacturing. You can get a brand new dumb phone with the functionality of like an old Nokia, but as good as it can be without being a smartphone. So that's a direct response to the smart thing. There's nothing smart about most of these devices or proposed agendas. Again, it's about monitoring, about measurement and control. From smart meters are probably the most well known in terms of like monitoring your energy consumption, and these things being live systems, two-way exchange of information, and of course you see this the potential there for not only two-way exchange of information, but two-way control. When I say control, I mean limitation or shutdown. So like people who are on prepayment meters currently, the old-fashioned, they used to be when you and I were young, coin meters.
I remember them well. I had a job once collecting the 50p pieces from those.
Yeah, exactly. When you don't put enough coins in, lights go out. Simple as that. You put more coins in. Now with a smart meter system, well, you've used. We're projecting into in the countries that you and I move around. I think probably the projected near future, but these things already exist, not only technologically but in some other parts of the world. A system whereby it would be smart meter. Well, you've used your energy quotient for the month. The lights go out, the heating goes off.
Yeah.
For example, so you have to be more careful next time. where the whole energy reduction agenda gets interesting for me is, and the last time we talked about the 1984 vision of a dystopian future versus the Brave New World one, which you rightly pointed out is more likely the model, for the globalist and the WEF and whatnot agendas. It is reliant on keeping people entertained, keeping people distracted, and a lot of that in itself is dependent on energy. For example, we used to joke about, when we had power cuts when I was a kid, the TV would go off and you'd have to light some candles. And what did you do then? Well, maybe sing songs, tell stories, play a board game, all of these much more human things. So for me, that's a really interesting question, all of this, which is like, keep reducing our energy consumption, as going forward in the name of green agendas.
Yeah.
In the name of reducing consumption, which is all these negative environmental impacts, apparently, but also keeping us placated. And all those systems are energy dependent as well. And I've always marveled at how energy hungry all of these Panopticon systems actually are. And they seem to be building these and building these and building these. So they're trying to cut energy consumption, but not only do the globalists, for example, and so-called elites not really worry about their own consumption in that regard, but they're constructing command and control and 24/7 matrix systems that are eating up energy at a rate of knots.
Yep. And they have to pound us with the BBC as well, don't they? The BBC's so bad now. The only programme I watch now on it is Match of the Day for the football. That's it. But even around that, they've got adverts for all sorts of Marxist things, and even in the football, they're inserting Marxism. This bending down on the knee, and wearing green armbands to signify how your club is environmentally. It's just politics is invading the one last thing, the one last island of sanity, which to me was football, and they've invaded that as well. So they need to keep us programmed with all of these Panopticon. Two-way. This is 1984 again, isn't it? The two-way receiver, where they're watching you while you're watching them. So, let's go on to the power thing again. So we've got these smart meters which cut you down from 20 degrees down to 18 and tell you to put a jumper on because you're using too much energy. Or they might even just, what they're seem to be doing at the moment is just making your power bill so high that you can't afford to use energy. Is this deliberate? Or just from the cock-up theory of history where they just made huge mistakes, which is put power prices up? Or is it kind of deliberate? Are they actually trying to cut people off from energy that way?
Well, when people have talked about, conspiracy theories in the past, I've tended to fall in with a lot of people who favor the cock-up theory of history as opposed to, the full-blown conspiracy. But when you have clearly stated and articulated agendas for management of energy, economy, environment, social systems, population, and all of these aspects of our society going forward. When you have them clearly set out, and then systems for them being put in to implement these being put in place systematically, some more successfully than others, you have to say, well, if Group A say they're going to do something, they will do something, and then they set about doing it, even if there isn't it doesn't appear to be them actually doing it. If it's somehow happening, if you were a detective investigating this, at the very least, you would say there appears to be a connection between the two. We need to look at that to see if there's anything to it. If you see what I mean?
Yeah.
If somebody says, "I really hate that person," I wish they were dead, and that person turns up dead, you might go and talk to the person who said,
Yeah, I think there's a thing with insurance, isn't it? I'm not allowed to insure your life because if you walk down an alleyway and don't come out the other end, and I've insured you and pick up on it, then it's a bad thing, isn't it? So that's actually illegal to insure somebody like that. So let's move away from energy then. Let's get into the big one. The big one, the third kind of stump to this wicket of the WEF is the environment. Now, I just must state my case first of all. I think global warming is a complete myth. I think we're in an interglacial. There was a glaciation 20,000 years ago, extremely cold. It got very warm. We went up to a Minoan warm period. We then went down and then back up to a Rome period that was warm. We then went down and then we went up to a medieval warm period, and all these warm periods were associated with a huge rise in civilization. Then we went really down to the Little Ice Age, We're coming out of the Little Ice Age. We're not as warm as we were in the medieval warming. We're not as warm as we were in the Roman warming. We're nowhere near as warm as we were in the Minoan warming. And there was another one before, I think a Holocene warming as well. That was even warmer. And to me, the next glaciation is late, and we will eventually be going back into another glaciation, just like we have 10 times in the last million years. So to me, the whole thing is complete scam. So that's my position. But their position is we're all going to die if the temperature goes up by 1.5 degrees. So they're coming out with lockdowns for saving the Earth. Now, they've tried it out with lockdowns for COVID, and they're planning lockdowns to save the Earth, to prevent us using energy and so on. Do you think that they can get away with that? Will people compliantly sit by and just let themselves be locked down to save the Earth?
Well, initially, certainly the COVID experience suggests that they will. Before we go any further, though, I'll just give my own position along the lines that you just did. Everything you've said about climate changes on the Earth over these glacial periods is, obviously true. This has been measured and tracked. All sorts of disciplines of science, record these things, analyze them, and make projections on that basis. Does human activity affect the environment and potentially the climate on a local or maybe even a global basis? I think we can see that. Why wouldn't it? I think we can see that it does. The question is, to what extent, and what do you do about that? You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So just because an effect is measurable, you then have to say, well, how big is it? What's the extent of it? So if you see what I mean, there's definitely questions to be answered there. For our purposes, in terms of globalist agendas and the future of human freedom, the question really is what the response to to all of this is. If we're being told that certain things are happening and certain so-called ameliorating measures are suggested, what does that amount to in effect? Not the idea of like, oh well, it says if we got this percentage of CO2 and then we get to this percentage, or if we go up by 2 degrees in the next 20 years, this will happen. It's like, what's happening on the ground? What's happening in your life, my life, our homes, our societies? And when you look at that part of it, then you begin to see how that ties in with stated agendas for control and curtailment of human activity. That's what I said right at the beginning of the COVID thing. This is about a massive reduction in human activity, generally, whether it's travel or consumption or expression or anything that we do that makes up our life on this planet. Rein it all in, reduce it, narrow its scope. That's what it's really about.
Yep. So
the environmental agenda, again, whatever you think about it, I often said, well, during the COVID period, I'll go on to state a position or an opinion and say, whatever you think about the origin of the virus, whatever you think about the nature of the vaccine, that doesn't matter. This, and then go on to state it. So it's not that it's completely irrelevant what people think about the origins or the nature or the future of climate change. It's just that, okay, that's one debate that we can have. But in the meantime, all this mayhem is being wreaked in our lives, and how much of that is actually justified? How much of that is simply, being fueled by, headline agendas that most people actually don't really understand and never take any time to look into. And when you look at the restrictions proposed on our lives and on human activity in general for the virus, and then you see the restrictions suggested the same for, for example, climate change, and you see that they're the same thing, the exact same thing, then you see that it's like it's just two, stumps of the same wicket, as you said.
Well, of course, lockdowns came out of China, the communist country. They flooded the West as the virus was spreading. They flooded the West with propagandists, particularly Italy. And then those Chinese propagandists in Italy persuaded the Italians to adopt the Chinese communist lockdown strategy. That didn't work anyway. And then all the other countries in Europe, except thankfully Sweden, said, oh, let's do it too. Let's copy this communist model of locking down. So, and then that was a good practice run for this save the planet climate change nonsense. Let's have lockdowns too as well. Now this is where we get to the bugs. So I did promise that we talk about the bugs. So let's talk about the bugs. This is all part of the reducing the energy spent on beef and meat and eggs and so on, to reduce all of that so that we have to eat bugs. Can you tell us what they said in the Great Reset about eating bugs? And is it serious, or is it a joke, or do they really intend to push this through?
Deadly serious. I mean, in the book itself, I can't even remember. They certainly talked about food. That was a major plank of proposed changes, because again, food and the environment and energy all playing together. Food is part of consumption. We eat too much, blah, blah, blah. The wrong types of food, and even movement of food around the earth. Foodstuffs is part of travel. It's all the same thing. It's just, human interaction around the globe. So yeah, I mean, you only have to look at the recent European Union measures, or whatever word you want to use for it.
Oh, the war on farming in the Netherlands, where they're shutting down all these farms.
That as well, but also about approving insect, foodstuffs, and basically, it's a bit like that we had crushed up. My childhood, we had crushed up beetles in cochineal food colouring. The red food colouring that would make your icing on your cake pink. Yeah, crushed up beetle. So again, it's nothing new. But so they want us all to be vegan, but at the same time they want us eating insects.
Yeah,
but if you look,
can we drill into that a bit? I don't get this, because Marxists do tend to go down the vegan road. Because Adolf Hitler was another socialist, was into vegetarianism, and Marxists do tend to go down this vegan road. How can you be vegan and eat bugs? I mean, recently I think Tesco in the UK had shellac on their apples to polish them. And shellac is made from the shells of a certain kind of beetle. You take the shellac and you polish the apples. So those shiny apples are covered in basically beetles. And vegetarians were holding pickets outside Tesco's, trying to stop people going into the shops because Tesco had the shellac on the apples. So how does eating bugs, which is the WEF communism thing, tie into veganism, which is another, it tends to be a Marxist kind of thing?
Well, if you're expecting internal or intellectual consistency in all of this, all of these agendas coming out of the W, you're going to be disappointed, because it's about bamboozlement. Some of these things are inconsistent simply because they're serving their agenda. They want to push the vegan thing. And by the way, if anyone listening or watching is vegan, that's fine, whatever. Do what you like. That's the whole point of this. Yeah. Do whatever you like. Just don't try and dictate to everyone else.
Yeah.
But so some of it serves an agenda, but some of it, I'm convinced, maybe not the vegan and eating insect thing, but some of it is deliberate bamboozlement. And we saw that and this is very 1984, we've always been at war with East Asia. Oh, but we've never been at war with East Asia.
Yeah, so, okay.
And that generates cognitive dissonance in people. So I'm sure a lot of these contradictory things are about just shutting people down intellectually, really. So to whatever extent they might have been engaged in what's happening around them and what the future might be, they get to the point where even with the best will in the world, a lot of people will just go, I just can't be bothered. I've got a job. I'm glad I've still got a job. I've got my family. I'm just going to go to work, come eat, watch TV, eat dinner, go to bed, repeat. And just, hope for the best.
Yeah, they're not going to make me become a vegan, but they will allow me to eat prawns and shrimp and lobsters and so on, and other bugs of various kinds.
Yeah, so I mean, the insects they've been a protein source for humans for as long as we know. In different parts of the world, humans are very adaptable, and in some parts of the world, they've eaten insects as a protein source. That's what was available locally. But you go to all extremes of the planet when there was much less movement globally. And there's very specific diets in particular parts of the world. I mean, first time I went to Thailand, and we were, want to get something for lunch while we were walking around town, and we saw some really nice looking chicken satay skewers on a street stall, and the same guy was offering crickets on a skewer as well.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my God, but that's part of the local culture. I didn't have a problem with it. I don't want it.
Yeah, I mentioned lobsters because I think lobsters and spiders and insects are all quite related. They're all arthropods, is it? I can't remember the exact definition. But I'm sure that at Davos, the only thing they ever get that's anything like a bug is a large lobster with a nice cheese melt on top of it.
Yeah, or what's that ultra refined beef from Japan? I can't remember.
Oh, Wagyu beef. Yeah. So no shortage of. I think 80% of my diet is either beef or bacon. So I think Wagyu's just a bit too fatty for me, though. It's a bit too fatty. Okay, that brings us on then, because we could spend hours and hours and hours on this. But let's just talk about this one last thing then. This is the 15-minute cities. We've seen in Oxford, I think in Oxford in the UK, because they've always been anti-car in Oxford, and it's full of people from the university, professors and so on, all subsidised by the state, and full of students or ex-students doing various things there for the university. So it's a very left-wing, what you might call high intellectual left-wing city. And I think they're trying to bring in these 15-minute zones where you can only drive your car in outside of your area, your nominated area, 100 times a year, and you face coercive fines if you get to the 101st journey. Now, I actually used to live near Oxford, and I used to drive across 2 or 3 areas to get to a Tesco, which had all the food and beef that I wanted in it. Are they bringing this in Oxford, and isn't it going to make life hell for everyone? And isn't this why we fought the National Socialists in the Second World War, to keep freedom of movement? They're taking away freedom of movement. This is getting really serious.
Yeah, I saw a meme today on social media, actually, and it was about the 15-minute cities. And of course, one of the things that makes social media work and, Twitter and bite-size culture work is compare and contrast with extremes. But it had a picture of a sort of dystopian 15-minute city idea, with everything being watched, controlled and monitored, and a bit like when you try and take a shopping trolley outside of a supermarket perimeter, the wheels somehow don't work anymore. I've never understood how that happens. And beneath it, it had a picture of the gates to Auschwitz. Again, very extreme comparison. Yeah. The idea was that 15-minute smart city, so many people will be going, oh, it's the future, we're saving the earth, and we'll be so much happier, we'll live local and support local and buy local and spend more time with each other, because we won't have jobs, blah, blah, blah. But if you called that a concentration camp, because that's just a name, names and words are so powerful, like what you call something, that's what you're saying about smart, calling everything smart.
Well, I think the term concentration camp was originally a euphemism for prison camp. So they called them concentration to stop them sounding bad. And then, of course, and then the Germans, National Socialists, borrowed the British concentration camp idea from South Africa, where they kept all these Afrikaans people in nice-sounding concentration camps. And now it's become an evil idea. So now we're talking about 15-minute cities.
Well, I can't remember, particularly in Australia, in the Northern Territory, what they called the COVID camps that they had, but they gave them some kind of, certain didn't call them COVID camps.
They probably called them wellness centres or something like that.
Yeah, or like a spa, weekend spa.
Yeah, or recovery area or something.
Yeah, but what you call things, and this is something to look out for, and I've spoken about this in terms of these agendas, the language used is very, very important. And this, again, is very Orwellian, because Orwell said, if you want to, attack people, the first thing you attack is language. Reduce the number of words in the vocabulary and choose words very carefully, and often make words represent the opposite of what they've meant to people before. Freedom becomes slavery is touted as freedom, and two extremes, but that's how
war is peace.
Yeah, exactly. It's very Orwellian. So I think that the I don't know what exactly is happening in Oxford, but even though I don't read or listen to mainstream news, haven't done for a long time, I do see headlines. I'm at the periphery of awareness. I'm conscious of the stories that most people are reading if they do pay attention to these things. And the smart city and the 15-minute thing is very much in the news at the moment. There's a UK organization called Together, and they're pushing back against this. And this is one of their main concerns, is from their point of view, the impact on the business, for example, of people not being able to get to them, a bit like you're talking about trying to get to your supermarket.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not actually against the idea because, I mean, I live in Gibraltar where everything for me is within 50 minutes. You can see that I've got an e-bike out there, which you might be able to just see on the video. And that's all I need. And everything is within 15 minutes of that e-bike. I don't need a car. I don't even know why people have cars in Gibraltar, but they do have a lot of them. So I'm not against the idea. It's this compulsion part. You will not drive your car, otherwise we will fine you. Also, as well, what they'll find is that there'll be certain things like your local doctor will be outside of your 15 minutes, or your hospital will be outside of your 15 minutes, or your school, the schools for your children will be outside of your 15 minutes, or your Tesco. There's a really nice Tesco in southern Oxford. It's brilliant. It's huge, but it's probably serving 4 or 5 of these local areas, and that you won't be able to get to Tesco to buy food. It's crazy and horrific, and you won't be able to use democracy to get rid of it in Oxford because it's such a left-wing political bias in that city. They'll be able to vote it through, just like congestion charging in London.
I think in terms of freedom and liberty and independence and diversity of choice, I think that the Tesco's of the future and stuff, ways will be found to get around that. You will be able to go to the corporate mart. You will be able to go to the corporate doctor. There will be ways around this. What you may not be able to do is go to the little guy, who's farming his own beef, and you go to his farm and visit him and buy that. Yeah. So independence, liberty-loving people who want to do their own thing and trade freely outside of any of these systems that we've been talking about, economic, whatever, they'll be the victim of all this. Yeah. But don't think for a minute that the big corporations are suddenly going to be impoverished, or that Tesco, whatever, is suddenly going to be wiped out by your inability to get there. There'll be some kind of workaround. But again, the little guy, I can think of endless numbers of vendors in my city, not just for food, but all sorts of things, for wellness products and books and this, that, and the other thing that I can get to within 15 minutes, but there's others not so much. And that's what some of the activism that I was speaking about a moment ago is about. Just the thing, hang on a minute, trying to get people who might be in favor, and I agree with you totally what you're saying about an ideal, but who might be in favor of this along the lines of what you're saying. They're thinking like that, but maybe not thinking through how this would play out in different situations, because like where you live is a very specific situation. The 15-minute thing works. Yeah. Maybe it doesn't work if you live in Birmingham, or it doesn't work if you live in the Scottish Highlands.
Or you live in Peterborough and you commute to London every morning, and you can get to London quicker from Peterborough than I could from Henley-on-Thames. So, because the train system is great from Peterborough to Euston, as long as you can afford the ticket, of course. So, yeah, it's this coercive nature, isn't it? A 15-minute city is great. Who wants to travel more than half an hour to their job? Who wants to travel an hour to go to a supermarket? But some people just have to. And what gives the right of these little dictators, these little tyrants, these communists, to lock us into these concentration camps, which is basically, to my mind, what they're trying to do. Anyway, I think we've covered most of the big parts of the Great Reset. Is there anything we missed out, do you think, that people need to think about?
I think it covers a lot, like the future of the entire species, really, in a nutshell. So I think we have covered a lot of the main points. If people want to explore further, they can do that on my website. They can do it with your future content, no doubt. And there's a lot of resources out there. And I will just say, if people are still thinking themselves, the Great Reset, isn't that a conspiracy theory? Which was even after
it's a book.
Even after the book came out. Yeah, but not only that, I kept this, bought it at the time. Even when this was on the cover of Time magazine, I saw people pick this up in the newsagents, look at it, didn't open it, put it down, and I knew what they were thinking. Yeah, that's not real.
Yeah, it's some future sci-fi dystopian novel. Though I do think it should be called Brave New World. I think The Great Reset is a terrible name for it. I think it should be called Brave New World, and I think that will give you a clue as to its actual nature. Anyway, that's enough on that stuff. It's very depressing. Let's talk about something more exciting. Let's talk about how do we fight back. We'll talk about the group, us believers in liberty acting together, in a minute. But to kick us off, how do you think each individual can fight back against this communist horror?
Well, first and foremost, don't pay too much attention to it, because these people are not gods, and they're no smarter by any means than you or I or anyone listening or watching. Maybe quite the contrary. It's just because they're control freaks and we're not. That's one of the reasons we're not sat on a mountaintop having a ride by private jet trying to control the future of the planet.
Yeah.
We're trying to, forge our own destinies with like-minded people.
Yeah.
In favor of the voluntary society, and that people who share the same goals can work together and not interfere in the lives of others. That's why things are the way they are. So don't give away certainly your intellectual and emotional life to this. It's real and present danger, but do sleep well at night, and do live well, look after yourself, and try and live well, because what the COVID episode demonstrated was how it was so devastating for so many people, in their personal lives and their work lives, social lives, and what they did to children, how it affected their education. So many people had their lives upended, and so many people have still not recovered from that. We should not allow that to happen to us, however grave the threat we face, because you do have to look after yourself first so that you're fit to fight.
Right. Can I just get to, I'm somebody, let's say I used to live near Oxford, and I used to drive into Oxford to go to Tesco's. Let's say I'm living in Oxford, and I'm in one of these 15 minutes locales, and my local communist council of Oxford puts me in one of these boxes. How can I fight against that as an individual?
Well, it depends on where we're talking, like what dimension, whether it's like technological, for example. If there was something like I said about the supermarket trolley, if there's some kind of system in place whereby your car stopped working if you drove past a certain point.
I'm sure they'll bring it in with electric cars and smart cars and.
This is why I'm in favour of having like a 1970s Ford Capri,
Yeah, they can't turn off a V12 in a gasoline car, can they?
Appropriate technology, as they used to call it back in the 70s, is being sidelined in favour of this overly complex technology. Because one of the things about all these smart systems is there's layer upon layer upon layer of complexity. As I said last time, they're incredibly energy hungry. And when they go wrong, it's catastrophic failure across the board. And that is actually, in terms of fight back, a great potential strength for us. You think in terms of the Matrix, and the folks in Zion in the second film, they were turning the technology against itself. And a lot of these systems are very hackable. Not suggesting anybody think along those lines at all, but do. Think of Tyler Durden in Fight Club. The best part of the film.
So I'm just getting over Matrix 2. I can't watch Matrix 2. It just makes me so sad.
I know, but it's still the idea there. It's the concept.
Yeah.
So, and I love that bit in Fight Club, Tyler Durden is there when they just detonate all the economic records, and the whole thing just goes back to year zero. So that sounds all very dramatic, but that's the kind of vision to keep in mind. And it's little things as well, as I said about, enjoying your day and having some moment of beauty or pleasure amongst all this. And we've always, as a species, when there has been tyranny, and top-down dictatorship, worked in little cells together, person to person. And there's certain things that they cannot regulate and they cannot control, and never will be able to. Again, last time we talked about transhumanism and AI. That's the goal there, is to take away this organic element of what we really are.
Yeah.
But as far as the 15-minute city in Oxford, we begin to find ways as soon as we start looking for them.
Yeah. I mean, I would just obviously move out, but then the value of my house, the price of my house has gone down, because unless you're a Marxist green zealot, which you might be if you're going to live in Oxford, you're not going to want to buy my house if I'm moving out, because I don't want to be in a concentration camp anymore. So it's all quite difficult. Okay, so that's an individual. Do these small things that you've suggested. What about the group then? Us as a group, the worldwide believers in freedom. There's not many of us. 1% of the world's population, or the Western world anyway, if we're lucky. What can we do to put these people back in their box?
Well, I think it's really a version of what I've just said, kind of writ large in a way. And I do think that we have, how can I put it, friends on the inside. And I think each day of the, so you pull a face there, but
Do expand.
Well, any one of these totalitarian systems is dependent on the enforcers. At a crude dystopian level, that means that the secret police and the riot police, they're the buffer between the top of the pyramid and everyone at the bottom that actually supports the pyramid.
Yep.
So it's a question of when, and we did see this somewhat in the COVID debacle. It's a question of when the people who are being required to actually suffer pain, whether material, economically, or whether being hit in the face, when they've had enough. I'm not doing this anymore. That begins to undermine, the systems above that, the more overarching system. Again, this is why the increasing move to AI and more automation, because it takes the human element out of it. Again, very Matrix-like. So that means that the elite would then almost like, they'd be cut off, and we wouldn't have that the human interaction. We couldn't appeal to reason or even to emotion in any of the enforcer level. I'd like to hear your thoughts on it, even just in terms of, because watching your travels during the COVID period and what you put up with, and what we all had to put up with in different ways. You must have come out of all that with some feelings about, if you find yourself in the same boat again, how you would do things the same, how you might do them differently, what you might have learned from all that.
Oh, well, I'm fairly happy-go-lucky. I can kind of just look after myself wherever I am. I didn't enjoy the experience, but I just thought on it, at least I didn't go through the Second World War. At least I didn't have to run onto a beach at Normandy and have heavy machine guns pointed at me. And that was the crisis in my life, and hopefully it's the only one that we have. So it was bad, and it was awful, and it was dispiriting. But I had friends where I was, and we just made do. It was a bit like going back to the Stone Age, because we had no vehicles. We were trapped at where I was in the Philippines. We were trapped in an area. We weren't allowed out the area. There was men with machine guns, and if you tried to get out, they would shoot you because they're 85 IQ and less. So we just kind of drank wine, watched Netflix, made food, chatted to each other. It was kind of a nice break, really. And the work I was able to do online via a system like this on Zoom. So my business did get hammered. We were on the verge of a huge business deal, and that all fell through because of COVID and lockdowns. So that wasn't great, but something else will turn up. So I just like to observe things and just be an observer and just kind of look down and observe everything rather than be. I'm not somebody who's going to storm the barricades. I'll just be observing the barricades with a camera and a microphone. How do you feel about storming the barricades today? So I'm a bit more relaxed about things than probably most people are, and just more of a remote observer on things. How else do I feel about it? I think that's probably it. Anyway, I'm interviewing you. You're not interviewing me. What's going on here? How did you reverse that there? That's terrible.
That's what I know how to do these things. But what you just said reflects what I was saying earlier about you've got to live your life, which is clearly what you did under those circumstances. So that's just something to take forward, But I think that, again, we feel that technology closing in around us and the 24/7, command and control matrix, surveillance everywhere and monitoring online of everything that we do is to be smart, to take their term away from them, about it ourselves, and to see what in that work for us, what can work against us, and to learn to differentiate between the two, to simplify and go back when we can, have that 1970s form Capri maybe, but to have whatever from the suite of technologies currently available that really serve our own ends. So, I, for example, own many cryptocurrencies. It's been a bit devastating the last year with all that.
Up 20% in the last couple of weeks, though. That's quite good, isn't it?
Exactly, but I got involved in that, and yet the cryptocurrency is almost exactly the same in form as the central bank digital currency that we've discussed. So it's about just not going all in with anything in particular, but just and you see these in the dystopian tales that we, fictional tales we talk about. People just say, "We can use this. We need to reject that." And meantime, time is ticking by, and you've got to find a way. You can't put your life on hold forever, no matter what.
Yeah, I think for me the hope is all these dystopian films that we see, such as the Hunger Games and various other things. The people eventually they have enough and they resist and they throw it off. And I think that will happen this time around as well. Let's hope it happens sooner rather than later, though, and before there's any kind of major kind of conflict situations. Like I said in a previous interview, I'm an irrational optimist. So I hope that people will say, no, we're not doing this, and they throw this off, and they take people like Tony Blair and Klaus Schwab and get rid of these parasites. We don't need them. Let's get them out of our lives. Anyway, I think we need to wrap it up there on part 2 of this talk about the Great Reset and the War on Liberty. Before we go, Greg, is there anything else you'd like to tell us about Legalise Freedom, or anything else you're working on?
Well, it's over 10 years now I've been doing podcasts. Find it in your video notes. There's 2 brilliant interviews that Greg has done on Legalise Freedom, which you'll be able to find. You know what I'm saying? Well, it's actually more than 2.
Is it 2?
Yeah,
right, okay.
With them. In fact, you were one of the first guests on the podcast when I contacted Hans Hermann Hoppe about Democracy, the God That Failed.
Oh, okay.
He said he wasn't available. He suggested you, and that's how we got them.
Brilliant. There's no greater recommendation on earth to that.
Well, there you go. But at the website, you will find hundreds and hundreds of podcasts, videos, and articles, because I write as well, on all of these topics, and many, many topics which are way beyond the remit that we've been talking about, history, culture, archaeology, astronomy. I do a very broad range of topics, but I think that listeners to Andy's podcast will certainly find at least some content of interest there. Yeah, it's a fabulous resource. I do recommend it. Do get onto it. Do have a look at it. Anyhow, before we all lose the plot, and I'm down to my last dregs again, which is shocking. Thank you very much for your time tonight, Greg. Next week, we're going to be speaking to Neil Locke. We're getting back to British politics again, a bit more prosaic. But once again, Greg, the fabulous Greg Moffitt, thank you for your time tonight. Everyone else, I hope to see you next week. Good night.